I just heard this girl's video about, she said, how if you're single and all alone, and how are you staying afloat financially? I'm underwater right now for sure. Just saying. I have cut my bills down. I have canceled my cable. I have a change jar for real backup with like $300 in quarters in my change bucket for emergency eating. Okay? We don't turn on the heater, the air conditioner. We turn all the lights off. Okay? Literally, I have menopause and I'm going to need that AC this summer, man. I'm telling you, it's St. Louis. It gets hot down here. But my food, I got my food whittled down to like barely nothing. I said, hey, it's okay to be anorexic. It's all right. I'm overweight by 45 pounds. It's all good. So, yeah, you make things happen. Every fucking boomer parent that if you did have one in your life that's not helping you, they go, you'll figure it out. You're damn right you'll figure it out. You're going to freak out. You're going to start selling your shit. You're going to start selling your shit. You're going to start hitting up people for jobs, and during the interview, you're going to be begging, but you already have a full-time job. I don't actually have a job, and I don't know how I'm making it happen. So this is how it's going to be.
There is a quiet shift happening right now that almost nobody in the mainstream wants to talk about. And it is not loud, it is not violent, and it is not chaotic, but it is far more dangerous than any protest or crisis headline. Men are not revolting, men are not rioting, men are simply walking away. They are disengaging from society, from its expectations, from its demands, and from an economic system that no longer offers them a fair exchange. If you stay until the end of this video, you will understand why this silent withdrawal is already damaging the economy, why it will accelerate, and why the consequences will hit far harder than most people are prepared for. Before we get into this, make sure you like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more great Angry Guy content, and you want every single video the moment we release it. That support matters more than you realize, especially when we are covering topics that many channels avoid. I also want to tell you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy if you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth. Inside the academy, you will learn how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, how to think long term, and how to protect yourself in a system that is becoming increasingly unstable. The Academy is linked in the description of the video, so go check it out now. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support for the work that goes into making them, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. That support directly helps keep this channel independent and honest. Now, let us talk about what is actually happening, because this story is not about resentment, and it is not about anger for the sake of anger. It is about incentives, economics, and human behavior. Societies rise and fall based on participation. When large groups of people stop participating, systems do not collapse overnight, but they do begin to starve. That is what is happening now. Men are disengaging from work beyond the bare minimum. Men are disengaging from marriage. Men are disengaging from long-term commitments. Men are disengaging from consumerism. Men are disengaging from civic duty. They are still present physically, but they are absent economically and socially. This is not theory. This is measurable. Labor participation rates tell part of the story. Marriage rates tell another. Consumer spending patterns tell another. When you put all of it together, a very uncomfortable picture emerges. Here's the uncomfortable reality that nobody wants to confront honestly. Women make roughly 80% of all consumer purchasing decisions. That includes groceries, household goods, clothing, subscriptions, lifestyle spending, and most discretionary consumption. At the same time, men contribute roughly 80% of all tax revenue, directly or indirectly, through income taxes, business taxes, and productivity driven taxes. That balance only works if men continue producing and women continue consuming at scale. Remove one side of that equation, and the entire structure begins to wobble. When men walk away from ambition, when they walk away from high output careers, when they walk away from building families and households, and when they walk away from heavy consumption, tax revenue shrinks. When tax revenue shrinks, the state panics. When the state panics, it raises pressure. When pressure increases without improving incentives, disengagement accelerates. This is the spiral we are entering. Most men are not asking for dominance or control. They are asking for fairness, stability, and dignity. They are asking for a system where effort is rewarded and risk is shared. What they are seeing instead is a system where responsibility is placed on them while benefits are distributed elsewhere. Over time, rational people stop playing games that are rigged against them. This is where the men walking away movement is misunderstood. It is not an ideology in the traditional sense, it is a behavioral response. When enough men independently reach the same conclusion, you get a trend. That trend does not need coordination. It does not need leadership. It does not need slogans. It simply spreads because it makes sense to the people experiencing it. Men are opting for simpler lives, smaller living spaces, fewer possessions, fewer obligations, lower expenses, minimal exposure to legal and financial risk. This is not laziness, this is optimization. When the reward for overperformance disappears, efficiency becomes the goal. When society punishes risk and responsibility, withdrawal becomes logical. What makes this dangerous for the economy is that modern economies are built on leverage. They rely on people taking on debt, starting families, buying homes, upgrading lifestyles, and consuming far beyond basic survival. Men opting out of that model removes the fuel from the engine. You cannot sustain growth when a growing portion of the population chooses sufficiency over excess. There is also a cultural layer that makes this worse. For years, men were told that their traditional roles were obsolete or even harmful. Provider, protector, builder. These roles were criticized, diminished, or reframed as unnecessary. Now society is shocked that men are no longer eager to fulfill them. You cannot remove meaning from work and expect people to work harder. When men stop striving, productivity declines. When productivity declines, wages stagnate. When wages stagnate, consumption declines. When consumption declines, businesses fail. When businesses fail, tax revenue collapses. This is not ideological, it is mechanical. The irony is that the very people who benefit most from male productivity are often the loudest voices dismissing male disengagement as irrelevant or deserved. That confidence will not last. Economic gravity does not care about narratives, it cares about inputs and outputs. Another layer that people avoid discussing is risk exposure. Men are far more likely to take on dangerous, physically demanding, or mentally exhausting work. Infrastructure, logistics, utilities, construction, manufacturing, emergency services, and maintenance roles are still overwhelmingly male dominated. These roles keep society functioning at a basic level. When fewer men are willing to do them, costs rise, shortages increase, and systems become fragile. You cannot outsource everything, you cannot automate everything, you cannot regulate away human participation. At some point, someone has to show up and do the work. When those people decide the deal is no longer worth it, the system pays the price. Men walking away also impacts innovation. Innovation requires risk tolerance, long hours, and delayed gratification. When men no longer see long term reward, they stop investing effort into building the future. They focus on personal stability instead. That may be healthy for the individual, but it is devastating for a growth based economy. This is why blaming men for disengaging misses the point entirely. Disengagement is the outcome, not the cause. The cause is incentive collapse. When effort, sacrifice, and responsibility are no longer matched with respect and reward, participation declines. The state relies heavily on male productivity because men disproportionately occupy the highest tax contributing brackets. When those men reduce output, retire early, downshift careers, or exit formal employment entirely, tax systems strain. Governments respond by borrowing more, printing more, or increasing enforcement. Each of those responses further discourages participation. At the same time, consumer driven sectors depend heavily on female purchasing power. But that purchasing power is often indirectly supported by male earnings. When men stop overproducing, household consumption contracts. Businesses notice this first through declining sales, then through layoffs, then through closures. The feedback loop accelerates. There is also a social trust breakdown happening. Men no longer trust institutions to treat them fairly. Courts, workplaces, media, and political systems are seen as adversarial rather than protective. Trust is the lubricant of cooperation. Without it, everything grinds. Men walking away is not about hostility toward women. It is about withdrawal from systems that penalize commitment. Most men still want peace, stability, and purpose. They just no longer believe mainstream society offers those things without unacceptable risk. This is why the conversation around this topic makes people uncomfortable. It forces a reckoning with trade offs. You cannot demand maximum contribution while offering minimum security. You cannot shame people into sacrificing their lives for systems that do not value them. Like the economy does not collapse all at once. It frays, it becomes brittle, services degrade, prices rise. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. Quality falls, people blame each other instead of incentives. By the time the damage is obvious, it is already entrenched. Men walking away is a warning signal. It is not a threat. It is a message written in behavior instead of words. Ignore it, and the consequences continue to compound. We are already seeing signs: declining birth rates, shrinking labor pools, increased reliance on debt, infrastructure stress, workforce burnout. These are not isolated issues, they are connected. The uncomfortable truth is that modern society was built on the assumption of male participation. That assumption is now breaking. Rebuilding trust and incentives is possible, but it requires honesty, balance, and accountability. Without that, disengagement will continue. To understand where this leads, you have to stop thinking emotionally and start thinking structurally. Societies do not function on intentions or slogans. They function on incentives, energy, and participation. When participation declines, systems compensate for a while. They borrow, they stretch, they pretend. But eventually, reality asserts itself. That moment is approaching faster than most people realize. One of the most overlooked aspects of men walking away is how quietly it happens. There are no marches, no banners, no speeches. Men simply opt out of expectations that no longer serve them. They stop chasing promotions that demand longer hours with no security. They stop competing in dating markets that feel adversarial. They stop spending money on status goods that no longer bring respect. They reduce exposure. They simplify. From the outside, this looks like apathy. From the inside, it feels like relief. For decades, men were told that fulfillment would come from contribution. Work harder, provide more, take responsibility, be dependable, be stable, be the backbone. Many men did exactly that. What they received in return was rising costs, shrinking respect, expanding obligations, and increasing risk. Over time, the message became clear: the deal had changed, but expectations had not. This is where the economy begins to crack. Economic models assume participation based on past behavior. They assume men will continue to overproduce, overwork, and overcontribute. When those assumptions fail, forecasts fail, budgets fail, programs fail. The state depends heavily on men, not just for taxes, but for compliance. Compliance is based on perceived legitimacy. When legitimacy erodes, enforcement costs rise. You need more bureaucracy, more monitoring, more pressure to extract the same results. That pressure feeds resentment, and resentment feeds withdrawal. It becomes a self reinforcing cycle. Men who walk away are not trying to punish anyone, they are trying to protect themselves. Many are choosing jobs with lower pay but lower stress. Some are leaving cities entirely. Some are choosing remote or informal work. Some are reducing their footprint to the bare essentials. Each individual decision seems small. Collectively, they reshape the economy. This also changes consumption patterns in subtle ways. When men disengage from traditional family paths, household formation declines. That impacts housing markets. Fewer marriages mean fewer starter homes. Fewer children mean fewer long term purchases. Fewer long term plans mean fewer durable goods. Entire industries depend on these life stages. Retail, real estate, finance, insurance, education, and healthcare all feel the downstream effects. Growth slows. Competition intensifies. Margins shrink. Workers are laid off. The pressure flows outward. At the same time, women remain the primary drivers of consumer spending. That is not an insult or a judgment. It is simply how modern consumption works. The problem is that consumer spending requires income generation somewhere else. When male productivity declines, consumption becomes debt driven rather than income driven. That model has limits. You can only run an economy on credit for so long before the bill comes due. When it does, austerity arrives whether people want it or not. Another layer of this story is legal and financial exposure. Many men have observed that long term commitments carry asymmetric risks. Marriage, for example, once functioned as a mutual partnership with shared responsibility and shared consequences. Over time, legal frameworks shifted. Many men now view marriage not as a partnership, but as a liability contract with unpredictable outcomes. Whether that perception is fair or not is secondary. What matters is that perception drives behavior. When men opt out of marriage, birth rates decline. When birth rates decline, labor shortages emerge. When labor shortages emerge, economic growth stalls. This is not ideology, it is arithmetic. Attempts to reverse this trend through messaging have failed because messaging does not fix incentives. Shaming men does not increase participation. Guilt does not create trust. Lectures do not change risk calculations. Men respond to reality, not rhetoric. This is why policies aimed at forcing participation often backfire. Higher taxes push more men into informal economies. More regulation discourages entrepreneurship. Increased surveillance reduces trust. Each attempt to extract more from a shrinking base accelerates disengagement. The quiet truth is that many men have realized they do not need much to survive. Food, shelter, internet, a small circle, minimal obligations. When you reduce needs, leverage disappears. A system built on leverage loses power over people who no longer desire what it offers. This is deeply destabilizing to consumer economies. Growth depends on desire. When desire fades, so does expansion. Men walking away also changes cultural dynamics. Without male investment, social institutions weaken. Clubs, organizations, volunteer groups, and community structures lose participation. Social cohesion frays, isolation increases. People retreat into digital spaces. Trust declines further. What makes this especially difficult to reverse is that disengagement feels rational to those doing it. There is no dramatic breaking point where men suddenly rush back. Re engagement requires credible reform. That means restoring balance between responsibility and reward. Another uncomfortable reality is that many women are also harmed by this shift, even if they do not see it yet. When male productivity declines, support systems weaken, prices rise, stability decreases, dating markets become polarized, the pool of men willing to commit shrinks, expectations collide with reality. This is not a victory for anyone. It is a slow mutual erosion. The state finds itself in a bind. It needs revenue, it needs compliance, it needs participation, but it also presides over systems that men increasingly distrust. Without structural reform, every intervention becomes another stressor. You cannot regulate your way out of disengagement. You cannot legislate motivation. You cannot mandate meaning. One of the most dangerous assumptions being made right now is that men are replaceable inputs. That if some walk away, others will fill the gap. That automation or migration will solve the problem. These solutions have limits. Skill takes time. Trust takes time. Social cohesion cannot be imported overnight. Infrastructure does not maintain itself. Power grids, transportation, water systems, and logistics networks require human oversight. When those systems are strained, quality declines. Outages increase, costs rise, everyone feels it. Men walking away also impacts defense, emergency response, and disaster recovery. These roles rely heavily on male participation. When fewer men volunteer or commit long term, resilience declines. The long term danger is not collapse, it is stagnation, a grinding, demoralizing stagnation where nothing improves and everything costs more. That environment breeds resentment across all groups. Blame replaces cooperation. This is why understanding men walking away is critical, not to endorse it blindly, but to recognize it as feedback. Systems that ignore feedback eventually fail. Reversing this trend requires more than speeches. It requires restoring fairness in legal systems, creating genuine economic opportunity, reducing artificial barriers, rewarding responsibility rather than punishing it, acknowledging trade offs honestly. Without that, men will continue to choose peace over participation. And from their perspective, that choice makes sense. To understand why this trend is accelerating, instead of slowing, you have to look at how modern societies respond to discomfort. When systems begin to strain, leaders rarely ask whether the structure itself is flawed. Instead, they look for ways to extract more effort from the same people. That instinct works only when trust exists. Right now, trust is evaporating. Men see institutions reacting to their withdrawal, not with reflection, but with pressure. Higher expectations, more rules, less margin for error, more moralizing, less accountability at the top. Each response confirms what many men already suspect. The system does not want to fix the deal, it wants to force compliance. This is why many men are not angry anymore. They are done arguing. Anger still implies engagement. Silence implies resolution. Walking away is the final stage after debate fails. There is a psychological component here that rarely gets discussed. Men are conditioned to internalize failure. When outcomes are bad, they assume it is their fault. But when patterns repeat across millions of individuals, self blame gives way to pattern recognition. At that point, men stop asking how to win and start asking how to exit with minimal damage. This shift changes how men relate to work. Instead of climbing ladders, they flatten their lives. Instead of chasing prestige, they chase autonomy. Instead of measuring success by income, they measure it by stress reduction. That recalibration spreads quietly through peer networks and online communities. The economy is poorly adapted to this mindset. It was built on aspiration and competition. It assumed people would trade time, health, and attention for future rewards. When belief in future reward collapses, the entire model destabilizes. One of the most revealing signals is how men now talk about work. The language has changed. Passion has been replaced with pragmatism. Loyalty has been replaced with transaction. Long term plans have been replaced with short horizons. These are rational responses to unstable systems. This is why productivity gains are becoming harder to achieve. People do not innovate when they feel disposable. They do not sacrifice when they feel unprotected. They do not commit when exits are punished more than failures. The ripple effects are everywhere. Companies struggle to retain skilled workers. Training pipelines weaken. Knowledge transfer breaks down. Institutional memory erodes. Younger workers are left without mentors. Systems become fragile. At the same time, policymakers continue to design solutions as if participation is guaranteed. They assume men will comply because they always have. That assumption is now outdated. When men walk away, they take with them more than labor. They take risk tolerance. They take initiative. They take leadership. These qualities are not evenly distributed or easily replaced. When they vanish, stagnation follows. This also explains the rise of minimalism among men. Fewer possessions, fewer commitments, fewer liabilities. When you have little to lose, you regain control. That control is intoxicating in a world that feels increasingly unpredictable. Consumer economies struggle under this shift. They depend on constant upgrading, constant dissatisfaction, constant desire. Men opting out of that cycle removes a significant stabilizer. While women drive consumption, many purchases are tied to household formation and shared futures. When those futures dissolve, spending contracts. There is also a geographic element. Men are leaving high cost cities in growing numbers. They are moving to cheaper regions or going fully remote. This hollowing out affects tax bases, real estate markets, and service economies. Urban centers feel it first. Governments respond with incentives, but incentives without trust feel like traps. Men who have been burned before do not rush back in because of temporary benefits. They wait, they observe, they protect themselves. This waiting behavior frustrates planners. Economies need momentum. When people pause collectively, momentum dies. Another dimension is social legitimacy. For a long time, men were told that their role was to support others. That message was tolerable when respect flowed both ways. As respect declined, the ask remained. Eventually, men stopped answering. This is not a crisis of masculinity, it is a crisis of reciprocity. People give when they believe giving matters. Men walking away also alters political dynamics. Disengaged men vote less, they participate less, they stop caring about outcomes they cannot influence. That vacuum allows extremes to gain ground, further polarizing society. The tragedy is that this disengagement hurts everyone. Women face shrinking pools of stable partners. Children grow up in fragmented environments. Communities lose cohesion. States lose revenue. Nobody wins. Yet the response continues to be denial. Media narratives frame disengaged men as failures rather than signals. That framing ensures the trend continues. The deeper issue is that modern societies have outsourced meaning to consumption and status. When those fail, nothing replaces them. Men are especially vulnerable to this vacuum because their traditional sources of meaning were dismantled without substitutes. Work without meaning becomes exploitation. Relationships without security become risk. Community without respect becomes obligation. Faced with that, withdrawal becomes logical. As this continues, we will see more men choosing informal economies, barter, freelance, cash work, digital income. These channels reduce visibility and taxation. States lose control. Regulation increases. Trust erodes further. The danger here is not rebellion, it is irrelevance. Systems cannot govern people who no longer care. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation are counterproductive. Shame accelerates withdrawal. Respect restores engagement. If nothing changes, the next phase will involve increasing pressure on those who remain engaged. Higher taxes on fewer workers, more obligations on shrinking contributors. That only accelerates burnout. Eventually, even highly productive men will downshift. The rational response to over extraction is exit. This is where the economy enters a trap. Growth stalls, costs rise, quality falls, people blame each other instead of incentives. Policy becomes reactive. Short term fixes replace long term solutions. Breaking the cycle requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths. Men are not walking away because they are weak. They are walking away because the cost benefit equation is broken. Until that equation is repaired, disengagement will continue quietly, relentlessly. As disengagement deepens, institutions eventually shift from persuasion to enforcement. This is the point where the tone changes. What was once framed as encouragement becomes obligation. What was once optional becomes expected. And what was once tolerated becomes punished. Historically, this is where systems make their biggest mistakes. When men stop volunteering effort, states attempt to mandate it indirectly. They raise compliance costs, they tighten rules, they increase oversight, they expand penalties. On paper, these measures appear rational. In reality, they signal desperation. People can sense when a system is struggling, and that awareness alters behavior even further. The problem with enforcement is that it works only on visible participants. Men who have already stepped back simply move further into the shadows. They reduce formal income. They shift to cash based work. They exit regulated spaces. Each attempt to tighten the net catches fewer people and angers those still inside it. This creates a division between compliant contributors and disengaged survivors. The contributors feel exploited. The survivors feel vindicated. Neither trusts the system. At this stage, policymakers often misinterpret the data. They see declining revenue and assume they need more extraction. They do not realize that extraction is the cause of the decline. This is the classic feedback failure that precedes stagnation. History shows that societies do not collapse when people rebel. They stagnate when people disengage. Rome did not fall because citizens stormed the Senate. It decayed because participation faded and incentives rotted. Modern societies are repeating this pattern in a digital form. Men walking away also reshapes generational dynamics. Younger men observe older men who followed the rules and ended up exhausted, isolated, or financially strained. They draw conclusions early. They skip steps entirely. They never enter the race. This creates a compounding effect. Each generation disengages earlier than the last. The pipeline of contributors narrows. The burden on remaining participants grows heavier. The education system feels this next. When men no longer see value in traditional paths, enrollment declines. Skills training shifts outside institutions. Credentials lose relevance. Employers complain about shortages while dismissing experienced candidates. Mismatches increase, and healthcare systems also feel the pressure. Fewer contributors supporting more dependents strains budgets. Quality declines, access narrows, trust erodes further. At the cultural level, narratives begin to fracture. One group frames disengagement as moral failure, another frames participation as foolish. Dialogue collapses, polarization increases. This is where societies often resort to symbolic gestures, campaigns, messaging, public shaming. These gestures fail because they treat symptoms, not causes. Men walking away is not driven by messaging failures, it is driven by lived experience. Until experience changes, behavior will not. There is also a moral hazard embedded in modern systems. Those who disengage reduce exposure to risk. Those who remain engaged absorb increasing liability. Over time, the rational choice shifts toward disengagement. This is especially true in legal and financial contexts. Men who avoid long term contracts avoid long term penalties. Men who avoid leverage avoid catastrophic losses. Stability becomes personal rather than institutional. As this trend continues, informal support networks replace formal ones. Men rely on peers instead of institutions. Knowledge circulates outside official channels. Authority weakens. States respond by centralizing power. Centralization increases distance between decision makers and participants. Misalignment grows. Policies miss their targets. The irony is that many of these policies are justified in the name of stability. Yet stability requires trust, not control. One of the most damaging assumptions being made right now is that disengaged men will return when conditions worsen. That assumption misunderstands human psychology. People adapt. Once adapted, they do not rush back to risk. Men who have learned to live simply do not fear downturns the same way. They have already minimized exposure. They ride out instability while leveraged systems panic. This creates resentment among those still tied to the system. They feel abandoned. They demand enforcement. Pressure increases again. The cycle repeats. Meanwhile, the economy continues to lose complexity, specialization declines, systems become brittle, innovation slows, maintenance becomes reactive. The long term result is not dramatic collapse, it is chronic dysfunction. Services become unreliable, costs rise, expectations lower, people adjust downward. In that environment, the idea of rebuilding trust becomes increasingly difficult. Each year of disengagement normalizes withdrawal. Each year of enforcement hardens resistance. Reversing this trajectory would require acknowledging trade offs openly. It would require reducing extraction pressure. It would require restoring fairness in legal frameworks. It would require respecting contribution rather than assuming it. None of these reforms are impossible. They are simply unpopular with entrenched interests. Until those interests are challenged, men will continue to choose autonomy over obligation. As disengagement spreads, the most visible consequences begin to appear not in spreadsheets but in relationships. Relationships are where economic reality meets daily life. When men walk away from long term commitment, it reshapes expectations on every level. Dating markets shift, family formation declines, social norms destabilize. What once felt predictable becomes uncertain. For many women, this shift feels sudden, but it has been building quietly for years. Men did not leave all at once. They stopped proposing, they stopped planning, they stopped investing emotionally and financially. They became cautious, observational, reserved. This was not indifference, it was risk management. Long term commitment used to be framed as a shared journey. Today, many men experience it as a one sided gamble. When risk outweighs reward, rational actors withdraw. This is not cruelty, it is calculation. As fewer men pursue marriage or long term partnership, competition increases among women for the shrinking pool of men willing to commit. Expectations rise at the same time availability falls. This mismatch creates frustration on all sides. Men feel pressured, women feel overlooked, and nobody feels secure. This insecurity feeds back into the economy. Households are economic engines. They drive consumption, stability, and long term planning. When households decline, economies fragment into individuals. Individuals consume less, plan less, and invest less. And children are affected next. Fewer children are born. More grow up in unstable environments. Educational outcomes decline. Social mobility slows. These effects compound over decades. The state responds with incentives aimed at families, subsidies, tax credits, messaging. But incentives cannot substitute for trust. Men who have already withdrawn do not return because of temporary benefits. They require structural safety. At the same time, cultural narratives often frame male withdrawal as selfishness. This framing hardens positions. Men who feel misunderstood disengage further. Dialogue collapses. This breakdown in understanding also affects workplaces. Cooperation declines. Team cohesion weakens. People protect themselves instead of collaborating. Productivity suffers. As trust erodes, people retreat into identity groups. Men form informal networks focused on autonomy and self preservation. Women form networks focused on mutual support. These parallel structures rarely intersect productively. The economy becomes segmented. Informal markets grow. Official statistics lag behind reality. Policymakers make decisions based on incomplete data. Mistakes multiply. Another critical factor is time horizon. Disengaged men operate on short horizons. They plan months ahead, not decades. Long term investments suffer. Infrastructure maintenance is delayed. Systems decay quietly. This short term mindset spreads. When enough people stop believing in the future shrinks. There is also a psychological toll. Men who disengage often feel relief initially, but long term isolation carries its own costs. Communities weaken, loneliness increases, mental resilience declines. These outcomes are rarely discussed because they complicate simple narratives. Women face different pressures. Economic instability increases stress. Dating uncertainty increases anxiety. Expectations clash with reality. Support systems strain. None of this produces easy villains, it produces friction. The most dangerous stage is normalization. When disengagement becomes normal, reform becomes harder. People adjust expectations downward. They stop demanding better systems. Mediocrity becomes acceptable. At this point, states often attempt large scale interventions, central planning, broad mandates, sweeping reforms. These efforts frequently fail because they ignore ground level behavior. People cannot be commanded into trust, they must experience it. One of the clearest indicators of this breakdown is declining volunteerism. Men historically formed the backbone of volunteer emergency services, civic organizations, and community maintenance. As participation drops, communities become more fragile. Natural disasters expose this fragility, response times slow, recovery drags, costs soar. The irony is that these failures are often blamed on funding shortages rather than participation shortages. Money cannot replace willingness. As systems strain, rhetoric intensifies. Leaders speak of unity while enforcing compliance, and citizens hear contradiction. Cynicism grows. The gap between official narratives and lived reality widens. People stop listening. At this stage, the economy enters a holding pattern. Growth stagnates. Innovation slows. Maintenance replaces expansion. People survive rather than thrive. Men who have already simplified their lives adapt easily. Those still invested struggle. Pressure increases to follow the same path. This creates a cascade. Each man who disengages makes disengagement more socially acceptable. The threshold lowers, the trend accelerates. Reversing this requires rebuilding reciprocity. Contribution must be matched with protection. Effort must be rewarded with security. Risk must be shared. Without these changes, the trajectory continues quietly, relentlessly. When people ask what the end state of this trend looks like, they often imagine something dramatic: riots, empty shelves, sudden collapse. That is not how disengagement plays out. The end state is quieter and far more corrosive. It looks like a society that technically functions but no longer advances. It feels heavier each year. Everything costs more effort. Nothing feels worth the price. In this environment, systems survive by lowering expectations. What used to be unacceptable becomes normal, delays are tolerated, shortages are explained away. Declining quality is reframed as adjustment. People adapt downward rather than demand better. That adaptation is how stagnation becomes permanent. Men walking away accelerates this process because it removes the pressure to improve. When the most capable contributors disengage, institutions lose the very people who once forced standards upward. Without that pressure, mediocrity spreads. This is why late stage systems often feel brittle and inefficient at the same time. They are complex enough to confuse accountability, but fragile enough to fail under stress. Nobody feels responsible. Everyone feels burdened. At this stage, the relationship between individuals and the state becomes transactional at best and adversarial at worst. Compliance is given only when unavoidable. Creativity disappears. People do the minimum required to avoid consequences. Innovation dies quietly. Men who have stepped back navigate this environment differently. Having already reduced dependence on institutions, they experience less shock. Their lives are not comfortable, but they are controllable. Control becomes the new currency. Those still heavily invested feel trapped. Mortgages, debt, family obligations, career dependencies. These anchors make disengagement difficult. Resentment grows, social tension increases. This tension often gets misdirected. Instead of examining systems, people turn on each other. Men blame women blame men, workers blame migrants, citizens blame leaders, leaders blame external forces. The real issue remains untouched. One of the most damaging effects of prolonged disengagement is the erosion of long term thinking. When people no longer believe that effort today improves tomorrow, they stop maintaining the future. Infrastructure decays, education degrades, skills erode. The cost of this decay is delayed but severe. Rebuilding is always harder than maintaining. Once knowledge is lost, it must be rediscovered. Once trust is broken, it must be earned again. Societies that reach this stage often attempt to manufacture optimism. Campaigns, slogans, narratives. These efforts fail because optimism without substance feels insulting. People respond to reality, not branding. And another common response is scapegoating, blaming disengaged men for societal problems without addressing why they disengaged. This deepens withdrawal. People do not return to systems that punish them for leaving. The demographic consequences become clearer over time. Aging populations strain support systems. Fewer young workers support more dependents. Taxes rise. Benefits shrink. Pressure intensifies. Men observing this dynamic conclude that participation only increases liability. Withdrawal feels safer. The cycle tightens. At the same time, informal economies expand. People trade services, share resources, bypass official channels. These networks are resilient but inefficient at scale. They cannot replace complex systems, but they can undermine them. States respond by attempting to reassert control. More reporting, more rules, more oversight. Each layer adds friction. Compliance costs rise. Trust falls further. This is the point where many systems enter a death spiral. Not because they collapse, but because they lose relevance. People comply only when forced. Voluntary participation disappears. The tragedy is that recovery is still possible at this stage, but it requires humility. It requires admitting mistakes. It requires redesigning incentives. These are rare qualities in large institutions. Men walking away is often described as a threat. In reality, it is feedback. Ignoring feedback does not eliminate it, it amplifies it. The longer disengagement persists, the more it reshapes culture. Independence becomes a virtue. Commitment becomes suspect. Simplicity becomes status. These values spread quietly. This cultural shift also affects how success is defined. Success is no longer accumulation. It is autonomy. It is peace. It is low exposure. Systems built on aspiration struggle in a culture that values sufficiency. Attempts to reignite aspiration without addressing risk fail. People will not chase dreams that lead to punishment. This is why many men now focus on personal skill building rather than institutional careers. Skills transfer across contexts. Institutions do not. Control stays with the individual. Over time, this produces a fragmented society. Highly self sufficient individuals coexist with dependent systems. Coordination becomes difficult. Collective action weakens. When crises occur, response capacity is limited. People help their own circles first. National responses lag. Trust deficits slow cooperation. The economic impact of this fragmentation is profound. Scale advantages disappear. Costs rise. Quality varies wildly. Inequality increases not just in wealth, but in resilience. The final stage is normalization of decline. People stop expecting improvement. They adjust goals downward. Survival replaces ambition. Comfort becomes relative. At that point, reversing course requires generational change. Those who adapted to decline cannot imagine growth. Those born into stagnation lack memory of better systems. Men walking away is not the sole cause of this outcome, but it is a major accelerant. When a large portion of the population disengages, momentum dies. The uncomfortable truth is that many men would re engage if the deal changed, if effort was respected, if risk was shared, if contribution led to security. These are not extreme demands. What prevents reform is not feasibility, but resistance from those who benefit from the current imbalance. They fear losing control more than they fear stagnation. As this video approaches its final sections, the question becomes simple. Does society choose reform or decay? Does it listen to feedback or suppress it? Does it restore reciprocity or enforce compliance? Men walking away is a warning, not an attack. It signals that the foundation is cracking. The future is not predetermined. Trajectories can change, but change requires honesty. It requires acknowledging that systems must serve people, not consume them. At this point, the most important thing to understand is that this situation did not arise because of one decision or one policy. It emerged slowly through thousands of small choices made by individuals reacting to incentives. That is why it is so difficult to reverse. There is no single switch to flip. There is no speech that fixes it. There is only alignment or misalignment. And right now, the misalignment is obvious to the people living inside it. Men did not wake up one morning and decide to abandon society. They adjusted, they adapted, they responded to signals. When effort stopped producing security, they reduced effort. When commitment stopped producing stability, they reduced commitment. When risk increased without corresponding reward, they minimized exposure. This is not radical behavior, it is human behavior. What makes this moment unique is scale. Never before has such a large percentage of men had access to information, alternative lifestyles, and peer validation at the same time. In the past, disengaged men were isolated. Today, they find each other instantly. Shared experience accelerates trends. This is why traditional corrective tools are failing. Shame does not work when people no longer seek approval. Fear does not work when people have reduced dependencies. Incentives do not work when trust is broken. You cannot motivate people who no longer believe in the outcome. The uncomfortable truth is that many men have already mentally exited, even if they are still physically present. They show up to work, but they do not invest emotionally. They participate socially, but they do not commit. They comply legally, but they do not believe. This hollow participation is worse than open conflict because it drains systems without renewing them. At the same time, many women are beginning to feel the downstream effects, rising costs, shrinking safety nets, increasing instability, dating fatigue, delayed family formation. These outcomes are often framed as personal struggles rather than systemic consequences, which delays meaningful discussion. The state finds itself in a narrowing corridor. It needs productivity, but it discourages participation. It needs trust, but it undermines credibility. It needs stability, but it incentivizes short term extraction. Each contradiction deepens disengagement. This is why reform becomes harder over time. Every year of delay allows adaptation to set in. People build lives around withdrawal, they restructure priorities, they detach expectations. Once that happens, even good reforms struggle to bring people back. Re engagement requires more than fixing numbers, it requires restoring dignity. Men need to believe that contribution will not be punished, that responsibility will not be exploited, and that long term commitment will not be treated as foolish. Without that belief, no policy will work. There's also a generational risk. Younger men are watching closely. They see older men exhausted, stressed, and uncertain. They hear the advice to work harder and do more, but they see the outcomes. They choose differently. They disengage earlier. This shortens the window for intervention. If this trend continues, the future looks smaller, not collapsed, but constrained. Innovation slows, ambition narrows, systems survive, but they do not inspire. People live cautiously, creativity declines. Society becomes risk averse in the worst way. The tragedy is that this is not inevitable. Societies have corrected course before. But correction requires acknowledging reality without defensiveness. It requires admitting that systems must serve participants, not consume them. Men walking away is not a threat to women. It is not a rejection of cooperation. It is a rejection of imbalance. When balance is restored, participation returns naturally. People want to contribute when contribution feels safe and meaningful. The longer imbalance persists, the more entrenched withdrawal becomes. That is the real danger. Not anger, but apathy. Not rebellion, but indifference. This video is not about assigning blame. It is about understanding cause and effect. Ignoring cause does not remove effect, it magnifies it. So the question is not whether men walking away will impact society. It already has. The question is whether society will listen to the signal or continue to suppress it. Because systems that punish feedback eventually fail, not dramatically, but quietly. And quiet failure is the hardest to reverse. To fully understand what comes next, you have to accept one uncomfortable truth. Systems do not change because they are warned. They change because they are forced. And force does not arrive through argument, it arrives through consequence. That is where we are now. Consequences are beginning to surface, and they will continue whether people acknowledge them or not. Men walking away is not a protest. It is not a movement in the traditional sense. It has no leaders, no headquarters, no manifesto. That is precisely why it is so powerful. It does not require coordination. It does not require agreement. It spreads through observation. One man watches another simplify his life, reduce stress, reduce exposure, and regain control. He notices the peace that comes with disengagement. He compares it to his own exhaustion, and he adapts. This is how human behavior has always worked. People do not follow ideology first, they follow outcomes. When outcomes favor withdrawal over participation, withdrawal becomes normal. The most dangerous myth still being repeated is that this trend can be reversed through pressure. That if men are criticized enough, taxed enough, regulated enough, or shamed enough, they will comply again. History shows the opposite. Pressure accelerates exit. It does not restore trust. Trust is the missing currency in modern society. Without it, every interaction becomes transactional. Every obligation feels like extraction. Every commitment feels like risk. Men respond by reducing exposure wherever possible. This is why men are choosing smaller lives, fewer obligations, fewer dependencies, fewer promises. It is not that they lack ambition. It is that ambition without protection feels reckless. So risk without upside feels foolish. Responsibility without respect feels exploitative. The systems that depend on male participation were built during a time when contribution was rewarded with stability. That trade no longer exists in the same form. Pretending otherwise does not change behavior. It simply widens the gap between narrative and reality. As that gap widens, people stop believing official explanations. They rely on lived experience instead. Lived experience tells many men that the safest path is disengagement. That message spreads faster than any campaign ever would. The state responds by doubling down on control because control is easier than reform. Reform requires admitting fault. Control requires only authority, but authority without legitimacy decays quickly. This is why enforcement feels heavier now. More rules, more monitoring, more penalties. Each new measure confirms the belief that the system sees contributors as resources, not partners. That belief hardens withdrawal. At the same time, women are being told conflicting stories. They are told that independence means freedom, but they are also told to expect stability from systems that are weakening. They are told that men are unnecessary while relying on structures built on male productivity. This contradiction creates anxiety, not empowerment. As men disengage, women feel the absence indirectly: higher costs, less stability, fewer long term partners, more competition, more uncertainty. These outcomes are rarely framed as consequences of disengagement, which delays understanding and reform. Children pay the highest long term price: fewer stable households, fewer mentors, fewer role models, less continuity. These effects do not show up immediately, but they shape generations. The economy absorbs the shock slowly. Declining participation does not crash markets overnight, it drains them. Growth slows, innovation stalls, maintenance replaces expansion. People adjust expectations downward. This slow decline is why so many underestimate the danger. There is no single moment of collapse to point to. There is just a steady loss of momentum. Men who have already adjusted are not shocked by this. They planned for it. They reduced exposure. They accepted less in exchange for control. For them, the decline is manageable. For leveraged systems, it is catastrophic. This creates a widening gap between those who are system dependent and those who are system independent. That gap breeds resentment. The dependent demand enforcement. The independent resist quietly. Tension increases. At this stage, many societies attempt large scale narratives about unity and shared sacrifice. These narratives fail because sacrifice without reciprocity feels dishonest. People do not sacrifice for systems they do not trust. The path forward is not mysterious, it is simply difficult. Restore balance, restore fairness, restore accountability, reduce asymmetric risk, reward contribution with protection, respect commitment instead of punishing it. None of this requires radical ideology. It requires humility. It requires listening to behavior rather than dismissing it. Men walking away is behavior speaking loudly. If the signal continues to be ignored, disengagement will deepen. Men will withdraw earlier. More will opt out entirely. Informal economies will grow. Institutional relevance will shrink. Eventually, reform will be attempted under crisis conditions. Reform under crisis is always more painful and less effective. The best moment to change was years ago. The second best moment is now. This video is not about telling people what to think. It is about describing what is happening. You can disagree with the interpretation, but the patterns are visible everywhere: declining trust, declining participation, declining ambition, rising pressure, rising resentment. These are not coincidences, they are connected. Men walking away is not an attack on society, it is a mirror. What society sees in that mirror will determine what comes next. If the response is denial, stagnation continues. If the response is blame, disengagement accelerates. If the response is reform, participation can return. People want to belong to systems that value them. People want to contribute when contribution leads somewhere. People want to build when building is safe. Remove those conditions and people will stop building. And that is the reality of this moment. Not dramatic, not explosive, just quietly decisive. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed here? Do you agree with this analysis? Do you see men disengaging around you? Do you see these economic and social shifts playing out in real life? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. Like the video if you like it. Do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.